Today, the budget crawler is going electric. So we've essentially got two components to this installed. Number one, the primary component being this electric fan. This is off of a 2003 Jeep Wrangler with a 2.4 liter engine. So the early four-cylinder Jeep TJs used a 2.5 liter that went from 97 to 2002. Then when they switched over to 2.4 liter in 2003, they switched over to an electric fan also. So this makes an excellent bolt-in swap candidate, and that's why we're using it. So component number two, or components, is going to basically be the electrical system that we're going to use to run the fan, and this is most of what we're going to use right here. So I'll start off with left to right, and we'll show you what we've got. This right here is the factory connector for the fan that came out of the Jeep that the fan came out of. Really don't need this. We could have just used some regular wiring and maybe a weather pack connector, or just some solid connectors and just connected it right up. But I happen to have this still, so I'm going to use this. Again, easily could be replaced by regular wire. Then the fan controller that we're going to use to turn the fan on and off is this derail unit. I got that off of eBay. I think it was like 25 bucks or so. We'll talk more about the cost at the end of the video. But it seemed like a decent unit, so time will tell on that one. And then basically it just comes with this relay here, and then it's got a temperature probe to read the temperature of the coolant. And in order to read the temperature of coolant with that probe, I got this little inline fitting here that will go in line with the top radiator hose, and that fitting will just screw right in here. And I'm not even sure how permanent this wiring setup is going to be, so when I finish the build, I'll probably either integrate this wiring into a more permanent fuse box, and probably this relay will be replaced with a relay inside of a relay bank, but that will be further down the road. The other option is I may end up switching back to a mechanical fan just for reliability purposes. We'll see. So why am I installing this? Generally, I subscribe to the philosophy, more wires, more problems. So the less wires we can have on a vehicle, the better, in my opinion. I think vehicles being produced brand new today are going to be an absolute nightmare to work on in another 30 years or so because of the miles of wiring they have inside them. Everything is just electronically controlled, and not my cup of tea, but that's neither here nor there. So why am I installing this? I did say the number one reason is because I already have it. If I didn't already have this thing on hand, I wouldn't have wasted the money buying it. It's totally unnecessary. It's just going to make my life a little easier throughout the build. So essentially, I'm trying to build this Jeep one project at a time because I think it makes better content video-wise. If I were not making videos on this, I would be working on probably 3 or 4 different modifications or projects at a time, just for ease of access to different parts of the Jeep or whatever I happen to be doing. That's how I built my V8 Wrangler, and it worked out quite well there. So I think I would also be doing it on here. Like I said, if I wasn't trying to make a somewhat cohesive video series on it. But basically, this is going to make my life a lot easier because the angle of the drivetrain in relation to the body is going to be changing a few times. So what that means is that we would have to constantly keep adjusting the radiator fan shroud up and down on the radiator. And installing this will eliminate that issue. So let's go ahead and get this installed.
Well, as we saw in the last episode, we've already got the cooling fan and the fan shroud removed. Pretty straightforward job. We just popped the coolant tank and the steering fluid reservoir off, and 4 bolts on the shroud to the radiator, and then 4 bolts for the fan to the engine, and everything just slid right out. So now in this episode, we'll go ahead and pick up with the install. The fan just slides right in place. Like I said, it's made for one of these Jeeps, so it's a real good fit. No easier electric fan swap than this one because it fits right on the radiator, actually clips in place, as you can see right here. I don't even have any bolts in it, and it's staying there. So from there, the bolts, all the bolt holes line right up like they should, and went ahead and stuck those things in, and the coolant tank right on the side where the mounting points are. Like I said, it's a factory fan, so just pops right in there. And we've even got a spot for the 4-cylinder power steering fluid reservoir, which You know, the 4 cylinders, I don't know why the reservoir is separate from the steering pump. Like on the 6 cylinders, the steering reservoir is built right into the pump, but for whatever reason, we've got a nice spot on there already from the factory to put it. Now, the only thing I had to modify in this setup was I needed a longer line to go from the reservoir to the pump, and I just went down to Napa and picked up some of that, and worked out great. So yeah, went ahead and filled the system back up, and ended up having to add a little bit of new fluid, which you see there is old fluid, but up in a second here you'll see some new fluid because inevitably plenty of it spilled right on the garage floor. So yeah, but with that done, we can go ahead and begin to drain a little bit of coolant out of the radiator. We don't need to drain the whole thing, just enough to get the coolant out of the upper radiator hose so that we can put the temperature probe in for the fan controller. And as you can see here, we did get enough out because we didn't start leaking any. So I went ahead and grabbed a nice little hose cutter, pretty convenient tool. Sliced the hose open and cut a little chunk out in order to get the housing in there for the temperature sensor. And fit real good, so we went ahead and put some thread sealant on the temperature probe. Pretty big fan of this stuff, man. It's worked out great for me in the past. I use it on transmission fittings and different coolant fittings, and just good stuff. I prefer to use it over the Teflon tape in dry applications, just because it's a little less messy, and when you take the Teflon tape apart, it can be a little stringy. So this stuff for me works out a little bit better. And yeah, so we just went ahead and threaded that into the housing and tightened her down. And of course, we've got the final install now. And this housing came with a couple hose clamps, and I opted to use those hose clamps, perhaps against my better judgment. They were very low quality hose clamps, and I very well may choose to replace them in the future, but for now, that's what we're just going to run with. And that pretty much concludes the hardware install on this. Now it's really just the wiring, and I'm not going to bother showing any of that because it was pretty boring and pretty straightforward. So let's go ahead and cut to the final install here. So here's the final product. You can see we've got the fan all in place, the coolant reservoir, the steering reservoir, and I ended up making up the wiring harness for this. I didn't show much putting that thing together because it was just pretty straightforward. Basically followed the wiring layout they outline in the instructions for the derail cooling relay unit, and that's pretty much it. So I'll just go through it real quick here. Basically what we have is this little temperature probe that reads the temperature of the engine coolant coming out of the engine. Once the engine coolant hits either 180 or 200, I can't remember offhand, but once it hits the specified temperature for the switch will close, which then sends power through this little harness, which goes between the airbox and the power distribution center, around the battery, right next to this little extra bunch of wiring I've got piled up right there, which does not actually go to anything, and into this relay. And once that signal hits the relay will close, sending full battery power up to the fan, turning on the fan. And in turn, that will obviously cool the coolant. And once the coolant gets below the lower temperature threshold on the switch will open, which will then turn off the fan. So really straightforward. However, I don't want the fan to run once I turn the ignition off for the engine. So in order to make that happen, I powered this sensor here by an ignition on only power source. So more specifically, I used the O2 sensor fuse inside the power distribution center using one of these little piggyback fuse tap things. This is only temporary. Once I get a little further along on the Jeep, I will end up putting a whole nother wiring fuse relay box somewhere in here, and at that point the wiring for the fan will migrate into there, assuming I choose to keep the fan, and along with the relay will also migrate into that box. So this is just a temporary fix. So I just stuck a really low amp fuse in there because the switch doesn't take much power at all. I think I used a 3 amp. If I had something lower, I would have used that. So I'm really not worried about drawing too much power or more power than this circuit is designed to handle off the fan. But that was the solution, to keep the fan running only when the ignition was on. Now, I'm not going to demonstrate this because it's about 20 degrees out right now, and it's going to take forever for the Jeep to get up to operating temperature to turn this thing on. But it works great, and it is extremely efficient. I didn't realize how much more efficient electric fans are than mechanical fans until I saw this thing in action. So just at idle, without driving the Jeep takes probably 10 minutes to warm up enough for the fan to kick on. And once it kicks on, it runs for 15 or 20 seconds at the most, then shuts off for another 2 minutes while the engine warms back up again. Fan then kicks on for another 15-20 seconds and just keeps repeating that process. So the fan runs very, very little to keep this engine cool. And compare that to a mechanical fan that's just running all the time and sucking power from the engine. The difference, I think, is just pretty incredible. Now, granted, this was a really small fan that was on here, so I think probably the power it was sucking may have been negligible. But regardless, every little ounce of power you can squeeze out of one of these things is a bonus. So, yeah, that's pretty much it here. Now let's talk about what this thing cost. So what did everything in this episode end up costing us? Well, number one, I already had the fan, so that didn't cost anything for me. I'll talk a little bit more about what it might cost for you in a minute here, but that was free for me, so that was a good start. The fan controller I got for $25.57 off of eBay. That was the cheapest place I could find to buy that particular fan controller. And we had the fuse tap, so the little piggyback deal that I used to tap into the O2 circuit in the power distribution center to feed the thermostat power. And on top of that, we had the radiator hose thermostat housing, so that black chunk of aluminum that we installed in the upper radiator hose. That ended up costing $9.99 off of Amazon, I believe it was. Then we had the power steering return line. So I needed to get a longer hose to run from the power steering reservoir, which was now mounted further forward on the fan, and run back to the power steering pump. Now this is purely a 4-cylinder specific cost, and it would not have been needed if this was a 6-cylinder Jeep to start with. So the power steering return line and the fuse tap I got both from Napa, local Napa Auto Parts. A little more expensive than I probably would have paid online, but it's convenient, and I like supporting a local business every once in a while. I know we're trying to build this on a budget, but it's kind of nice to go and spend some money locally every once in a while. But with all that being said, the total cost for this episode for me was $64.32. Now, what would it cost you if you didn't already have a fan like this sitting around? Well, I did some poking around on Craigslist and found a guy pretty local to me who was selling a Ford Taurus fan, which is a really popular electric fan swap into these Jeeps. He was selling a Taurus fan, a controller, thermostat, housing, basically everything you needed to just plug and play install in your Jeep for $150. So I'd say I saved, $80-90 by already having the fan. And if I didn't already have it, like I said earlier, I wouldn't have bothered swapping it in because, in my opinion, it's just not worth the cost. It's not really a high-performance vehicle, and I don't think that the stock fan, because it was so small, was really sapping too much power out of this engine, but every little bit we can gain, I suppose, is a good thing. So, what is the total build cost up to? Now, with the previous total added with our new total, we end up coming up with $1,822.49. So we're still not doing too bad. However, the worst has yet to come. We'll be getting into axles and gearing, transfer case, etc. pretty soon. So that price is going to jump up quite a bit. But still, like I said, we're aiming to keep this below $5,000, vehicle purchase price included. So with all that being said, thanks again for staying tuned. Always appreciate you watching, and if you don't mind, go ahead down and hit that thumbs up button. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.